You know that incredibly specific, almost haunting feeling that arrives right after you finally secure the thing you've oriented your entire life around.
Oh, man. Absolutely. It's so universal.
Right. I mean, you get the promotion you've been ruthlessly grinding for over the last 3 years, or maybe you finally close on the house you've been saving for.
Yeah, or you finally close the distance in a long-distance relationship.
Exactly. Or you hold the physical award in your hands. And for months or maybe even years, your entire psychological landscape, your entire architecture of motivation has been pointed at this one singular peak.
You summit the mountain.
You summit the mountain, you plant the flag, and, maybe for an hour or a day or a week, it feels exactly like you projected it would.
Right, it feels like permanent, unassailable bliss. You think you've made it.
But then, almost with this terrifying inevitability, you wake up on a random Tuesday. You're standing in your kitchen, you're drinking your coffee, and you are hit with this creeping, very quiet, almost embarrassing thought.
Is that all there is, thought?
Yes. The thought is just, literally, is that all there is?
It really is the great silent letdown of human experience, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's that jarring moment when the confetti settles and you realize you're left holding a very ordinary broom to sweep it up.
That is a perfect way to put it. A very ordinary broom.
Yeah, because the grand narrative you constructed around the achievement suddenly evaporates, and it leaves you with the mundane reality of just, well, continuing to exist.
And usually, I mean, the cultural reflex is to treat that feeling as a personal psychological failure. Like we pathologize it completely.
We absolutely do. We blame the individual.
Right. We tell ourselves we just didn't appreciate the goal enough, or we have a dopamine deficit, or we need to practice a more rigorous gratitude routine.
Or the worst one, we just need a new, much bigger goal to chase.
Yes, the constant upgrading of the goal. But today, we are going to look at a stack of philosophical texts that suggest a radically different, structurally profound interpretation of that Tuesday morning letdown.
Which is so refreshing, honestly.
It really is. So we are diving deep into the architecture of Arthur Schopenhauer's thought. We're tracing the rather dark roots of traditional philosophical pessimism. And then we are going to dissect a modern, incredibly surgical reinterpretation of this entire lineage.
And that modern reinterpretation is called internalism.
Exactly. Internalism. But before we get into the weeds, I feel like we need to set the parameters for this deep dive immediately.
Yeah, we definitely do, because delving into the pessimistic tradition often triggers this immediate allergic reaction in people.
Right. People hear pessimism and they want to tune out.
Exactly. So our mission today is not to wallow in despair. We aren't here to validate a gloomy disposition or argue that the universe is fundamentally evil.
No, we're looking for something much more specific.
Right. Our goal is to extract the hardest, most undeniable truth at the very bottom of the pessimistic worldview, what modern philosophers in our sources are calling its existentially immune core.
The existentially immune core. I love that phrase.
It's brilliant. We want to understand the exact mechanics of why suffering commands our normative attention in the absolute way that it does, even if your baseline disposition is, like, radically optimistic.
We are hunting for the bedrock. We're looking for the philosophical concrete beneath all the cultural framing we usually put on these things.
Exactly. But to isolate that bedrock, that existentially immune core, we have to start by immersing ourselves in the foundational mechanics of human desire.
Which means looking at history's most notorious pessimist. Let's jump into Arthur Schopenhauer's basic phenomenological diagnosis of reality.
It is quite the diagnosis, to put it mildly.
Oh, it's intense. When you read him, it's basically a direct assault on the Enlightenment idea of the rational sovereign self, right?
It completely upends it.
Yeah, he completely rejects the Cartesian notion that we are primarily thinking things that just occasionally experience desires.
He upends it entirely. I mean, the traditional assumption is that we sit in the driver's seat of our consciousness, right? We use our intellect to logically assess what external objects will bring us equilibrium, and we rationally steer toward them.
Like we're pilots of our own minds.
Exactly. But Schopenhauer argues that this rational agency is a thin, fragile illusion. Beneath our individual personalities, beneath our intellect, beneath the entire phenomenal world, there is a fundamental, restless force.
And he calls that force the will.
Yes, the will. And he doesn't mean willpower in the, modern self-help sense.
Look, I'm going to use my willpower to go to the gym. Not that.
Not that at all. He means a blind, relentless, almost mechanical striving. It is a metaphysical energy that manifests within us as hunger, as sexual drive, as the instinct for dominance, as fear, and as this constant vibrating restlessness.
Wow.
For Schopenhauer, a conscious being is not a rational entity seeking peace. It is an entity structurally defined by striving.
So the implication there is that to be alive, to be conscious at all, is to be a creature of lack. The architecture of a desiring being is fundamentally an architecture of absence.
That is the core of his phenomenological diagnosis, yeah.
That is wild to think about.
It is, because if you are a being that wants, you are inherently a being structured by what you do not have. To desire a thing is, by definition, to be separated from the thing that is desired.
So the pain of lack is the baseline condition.
Exactly. Schopenhauer is arguing that we are entirely mistaken about the default state of human consciousness. We think the default state is peace, and desire is something we just occasionally engage in.
Oh, I see. He flips it.
He says the default state is the agonizing tension of the will, and peace is merely the fleeting absence of that tension.
I was trying to map this onto a modern technological equivalent while going through the sources. It strikes me that we are essentially walking around as smartphone batteries, but the biological and psychological hardware is designed such that the battery is constantly, relentlessly draining.
Oh, that's a fantastic analogy.
Right. Because when we eat a meal, or achieve a career milestone, or secure a romantic partner, we operate under the delusion that we are finally fixing the battery.
We think we are going to reach 100% and just stay there forever.
Exactly. But plugging it in doesn't alter the fundamental nature of the battery. It merely delays the inevitable discharging. The battery's entire ontological purpose is defined by its depletion.
That analogy holds up beautifully under Schopenhauer's framework. Because, the battery never achieves a state of eternal equilibrium. It immediately begins discharging the second it's unplugged.
It just drops right to 99%.
Immediately. And our sources provide some incredibly stark, everyday, phenomenological examples of how this deprivation structure dictates our lives.
Yeah, let's talk about those.
Take hunger. You eat a spectacular, deeply fulfilling meal. For a brief window, you are completely satiated. The tension is gone.
You're at 100%.
Right. But that fulfillment doesn't permanently abolish the physiological structure of hunger. It merely resets the countdown timer. A few hours later, the lack inevitably regenerates. The will reasserts itself.
And it scales up perfectly to our higher order psychological drives too, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Like, look at ambition. You hit a massive career milestone, but the realization of that goal immediately establishes a new normalized baseline.
Yeah, the goalposts just move.
They move instantly. That new baseline instantly generates new standards, new peer comparisons, and new anxieties about maintaining your status.
Or romantic longing. That's another huge one in the text.
You're right. You spend months pining for someone, convinced with absolute certainty that they are the missing puzzle piece that will permanently complete your psychological landscape.
And then what happens?
Well, the longing is eventually replaced by possession, but possession morphs into an entirely new set of tensions.
Like anxiety about losing them.
Exactly. Or the friction of cohabitation, or just the creeping, quiet rot of routine boredom.
We observe this recursive loop everywhere. Social status doesn't culminate in a final resting state of peace. It just elevates you into a higher bracket where you generate more sophisticated, stressful comparisons.
Even our leisure activities, the very things we utilize to escape the striving, rarely furnish actual tranquility.
They function primarily as diversions from our baseline restlessness.
I mean, the promised finally, as in, I will finally be happy when I achieve X, is just a structural mirage. It never actually arrives and unpacks its bags to stay.
I love how the source material distills this. The author basically argues that we are constantly engaged in this striving that we mistake for actual fulfillment.
When in reality, what is it?
It's just temporary relief from the pain of wanting. We are applying a brief analgesic to the lack and tricking ourselves into thinking we've cured the underlying disease of desire.
The phrasing in the text is incredibly precise regarding that self-deception. It highlights the stark contrast between the anticipation of an object and the acquisition of it.
Desire is essentially the greatest marketing executive in the universe.
That's hilarious, but it's so true.
It is. It points to a future state and says, there, that is where the tension ends. But when you actually arrive at fulfillment, the feeling is usually a hollow, echoing, is that all?
And the moment that question is asked, the will pivots, identifies a new object of lack, and the desire cycle begins anew.
The text utilizes two brilliant words to capture this dichotomy: transfiguration versus thusness.
Oh, I wanted to talk about those terms. They're so good.
Let's unpack them. Desire promises transfiguration. It implies a complete metamorphosis of your lived reality. You genuinely believe, when I secure this job, I won't just be my current self with a new job title. I will be a structurally different, glowing, immune, upgraded version of myself.
But fulfillment just delivers thusness.
Thusness, the sheer, unadorned, mundane reality of the object itself.
Right, like you get the luxury car and the metaphysical aura you projected onto it just immediately collapses.
It's no longer a chariot of salvation. It's just a heavy piece of machinery made of metal and plastic that requires oil changes and, occasionally gets a flat tire.
You get the dream house, and it's just a structure of drywall and plumbing that you have to clean on weekends.
Exactly. The transfiguration was a psychological projection generated by the tension of the will. The thusness is all that actually exists.
So, if you accept this phenomenological mapping, if life is fundamentally just a pendulum swinging continuously between the agonizing tension of wanting something and the eventual hollow boredom of actually possessing it, it is very easy to see how this metastasizes into a distinctly pessimistic worldview.
Oh, completely. It's a very dark logical conclusion.
If you follow Schopenhauer's logic to its absolute conclusion, you end up looking at existence as a fundamentally raw deal. But, pessimism is a notoriously slippery term in philosophy.
It is. It's not just an aesthetic mood or a clinical depression.
Right. It's vital to separate the rigorous philosophical tradition of pessimism from the casual colloquial use of the word.
Definitely. Because traditional optimism, which is kind of the prevailing cultural default, treats suffering as a local anomaly.
It views suffering as a bug in the code of reality.
Yes, a bug. The underlying assumption is that with enough technological innovation, enough therapeutic intervention, enough economic progress, we can systematically patch these bugs until the software of human existence runs perfectly.
It's deeply utopian.
It is. But traditional pessimism, conversely, suspects that suffering is not a bug to be patched.
It argues that suffering is a fundamental feature of the code itself.
A feature, yes. It is structurally entangled with the condition of being alive. It posits that life's architecture is inherently characterized by need, frustration, physical decay, vulnerability, and conflict.
It's not merely that some specific unfortunate lives go poorly, it's that life as such is woven out of profoundly difficult antagonistic materials.
And as the sources trace the evolution of this thought, we see it splinter into various domains.
What are the main flavors of it?
Well, you have psychological pessimism, which is merely the cognitive habit of expecting adverse outcomes.
Like the classic Eeyore disposition.
Exactly, the glass half empty crowd. Then you see it scale up into cultural pessimism, which is the historically focused belief that civilization is locked in an inevitable trajectory of decline.
Like kids these days and society is doomed.
Right. But neither of those capture the core of Schopenhauer's project. He was operating in the realm of metaphysical pessimism.
Metaphysical pessimism.
Yes, the belief that existence itself, the very ontological fabric of reality, is structurally flawed or inherently negative.
But taking that full metaphysical leap, declaring the entire universe fundamentally rotten, feels like an enormous unjustified overreach.
It really does.
It's what makes traditional totalizing pessimism feel so incredibly exhausting and, frankly, intellectually fragile. Walking around all day condemning the cosmos, shaking your fist at the sky, and pronouncing an ultimate negative verdict on all of reality just seems like a massive category error.
You're exactly right. You are projecting human suffering onto the vast, indifferent mechanics of the universe.
It is a massive category error, right?
Yeah. It is, and it makes the traditional pessimistic position philosophically unstable. You end up having to defend the absurd claim that everything, everywhere, at all times is bad.
Which forces you to perform incredible mental gymnastics to explain away profound moments of joy, beauty, and love.
Precisely, and this is exactly where the texts introduce internalism.
Ah, the hero of our deep dive.
Internalism steps into this tradition to perform a highly sophisticated philosophical surgery. It wants to extract the deep, undeniable insights about suffering from Schopenhauer, but it completely severs them from his totalizing cosmic despair.
So it's keeping the baby and throwing out the metaphysical bathwater.
Exactly. It wants to take suffering with absolute normative seriousness without needing to throw the entire universe into the garbage bin to justify doing so.
The author gives a perfect thesis statement for this shift, pointing out that internalism does not require us to condemn the totality of existence just to take suffering seriously. We don't need a God's eye view of a ruined cosmos.
We really don't.
But if internalism is abandoning the metaphysical condemnation of the universe, where is its normative judgment actually coming from? Like, what is it anchoring its pessimism to?
It anchors it strictly to the phenomenology of the feeling itself. This brings us to the internalist principle, which is the foundational bedrock of the entire source text.
Let's unpack that.
To grasp this, we have to look closely at how we traditionally construct normativity, the idea of what ought or ought not to be. Usually, we think the badness of an event comes from an external framework.
Like religion or societal rules.
Right. We think suffering is bad because it violates a divine law, or because it hinders societal progress, or because it contravenes a universal moral imperative. The normativity is a decoration hung onto the event from the outside.
Oh, I see. Internalism completely rejects that external dependency.
It does. It argues that you do not need a theology, a sociology, or a Kantian imperative to find a secure, unshakable sense of what ought not to be.
Because the most epistemically secure piece of data in the entire universe is valenced experience.
Valenced experience. Specifically, an experience that inherently feels bad.
When we analyze physical agony or profound emotional grief, we are not looking at a neutral, blank sensation that a philosopher later evaluates and slaps a bad sticky note onto.
No, the suffering is internally aversive.
The moment the suffering occurs, it presents itself immediately to the conscious subject as to be ended, as to be escaped, as fundamentally not to be. The normative objection is woven directly into the fabric of the feeling.
Think about the pure immediacy of a severe burn.
Okay, let's use that analogy.
If you accidentally place your hand on a red-hot stove, you don't pause your reaction to consult a theology textbook, right?
Right. Let me check what my priest says about this. No.
Or check the latest sociological consensus, or run a utilitarian calculus to deduce, society and logic dictate that this extreme heat is negative, therefore I shall initiate the removal of my hand.
No, the badness is literally baked into the burn. The experience itself is screaming its own absolute objection to its own existence. It contains its own negative authority.
That immediacy is everything. The ought not is not imposed from an external perspective. It is disclosed entirely within the parameters of the suffering itself. The meaning of the feeling is inherent to the feeling.
It is a self-contained, closed loop of normativity.
Exactly. The badness of the suffering is not assigned by an observer. It is disclosed to the experiencer.
And because it is completely self-contained, because it relies on absolutely nothing outside of its own phenomenal reality, we arrive at that brilliant phrase from the beginning, the existentially immune core.
That's right. A philosophical view is existentially immune if it can survive the catastrophic collapse as every single external framework we possess.
So imagine a hypothetical scenario where every macro narrative we use to make sense of the world disintegrates.
Okay.
We definitively prove that God does not exist, so theological meaning collapses. We realize human history is just random Brownian motion, so narratives of moral progress collapse.
Right.
Does a severe radiating toothache suddenly lose its negative valence? Does it revert to a neutral sensation?
Obviously not. The sheer physiological panic and aversion of the pain remains completely intact.
Exactly. Even if we discover that life has absolutely no cosmic purpose, or that all of our grand human achievements will eventually be swallowed by the expanding sun and forgotten forever.
Suffering remains internally aversive.
Yes. The feeling of acute grief, the feeling of physical torture, the feeling of profound, crushing isolation, none of these require a cosmic context to be deeply, inherently objectionable to the conscious entity enduring them.
The text summarizes the power of this position beautifully. It points out that this existentially immune core is smaller than cosmic despair because it doesn't arrogantly claim the whole universe is evil.
But it is vastly stronger than optimism.
Much stronger, because no amount of positive framing or utopian thinking can erase the immediate internal badness of a severe physical burn. The burn's authority is absolute.
It is an incredibly robust, defensible foundation. But bringing up the collapse of all these external frameworks inevitably triggers a massive alarm bell for anyone well-versed in philosophy.
Well, sure, the N-word.
Right. If we are systematically stripping away all external meaning, no cosmic plan, no divine architecture, no objective universal moral laws, doesn't internalism just collapse into nihilism?
That is the exact tension the texts anticipate, because on the surface, stripping away external meaning sounds identical to the nihilist project.
But the authors are emphatic that internalism and nihilism are not just distinct. They are fundamentally opposed to one another.
They are mortal enemies, really.
Okay.
We need to clearly map the borders between traditional pessimism, nihilism, and internalism.
Let's do that. It's a crucial trilemma.
So nihilism makes a totalizing claim of emptiness. Absolutely nothing matters. There is no inherent value, no objective good, no objective bad. It is the complete erasure of all normative significance.
Right. And traditional pessimism, on the other hand, claims that suffering matters too much.
Yes, it looks at the sheer volume of agony in the world, becomes overwhelmed, and leverages that suffering to condemn the entire architecture of the cosmos.
It puts the universe on trial and declares it guilty.
Exactly, and internalism steps right between them, acting as the necessary corrective to both.
What does it say to the nihilist?
It says to the nihilist, I concede that your grand external value systems might be fictions, but I completely reject your final conclusion. The collapse of external meaning does not equal the neutrality of conscious experience.
And what does it say to the traditional pessimist?
It turns to them and says, I agree that suffering is profoundly bad, but you have no epistemic right to judge the entire cosmos. Let's not use the word matters until we can precisely locate where its normative grip actually comes from.
Wow. And, as we established, that grip comes strictly from the internal directional structure of the suffering itself.
The nihilist can successfully erase all the moral decorations we hang on the universe, but they cannot erase the internal character of a broken femur.
Right. Nihilism can whisper in your ear that the universe is indifferent to your shattered bone, but nihilism cannot make the shattered bone stop throbbing with negative valence.
The authors capture this brilliantly by distinguishing between cosmic meaning and valence. The failure of the former does not necessitate the failure of the latter.
Which leads to what I think is the most elegant conceptual tool in the entire stack of sources. The idea that meaning fails upward before it fails inward.
It's a gorgeous phrase. Let's really unpack what failing upward implies.
Failing upward is a spatial metaphor for the collapse of macro-narratives.
Right. It means that when you look up and out at the grand, macroscopic, cosmic scale, the meanings we project there might turn out to be entirely void.
There may be no divine architect carefully guiding history.
The arc of the moral universe might not actually bend toward justice. The sky above us might be a completely empty, indifferent void of radiation and dark matter.
So the meaning up there fails.
But the critical move is recognizing that failing upward does not automatically trigger a failure inward.
Exactly. Even if the macro meaning fails completely, the micro meaning, the inward significance of conscious experience, remains utterly intact and authoritative.
The absence of a divine plan does not erase the inner asymmetrical reality of suffering.
A mother's acute, devastating grief over the loss of a child doesn't suddenly lose its phenomenological weight just because the universe is expanding randomly without purpose.
No, of course not. The significance is grounded inward, rooted entirely in the reality of the valenced experience itself.
This precise delineation is what stops pessimism from bloating into that unstable, exhausting monster we talked about earlier. You can't stand completely outside the universe in some hypothetical objective void and judge the whole thing.
You can only judge what is actually disclosed to you within the parameters of your own conscious experience.
Nihilism says nothing matters. Pessimism says suffering matters too much. Internalism demands that we only apply the concept of mattering, where the internal grip of valence justifies it.
It acts as an incredibly precise surgical instrument. It allows us to acknowledge the profound, undeniable reality of suffering without throwing our hands up and declaring existence a total mistake.
Now, if we take this refined instrument, internalism, we could loop back to Schopenhauer and perform some much-needed corrective surgery on his original 19th century framework.
Yes, let's fix Schopenhauer.
Because while he brilliantly identified the deprivation structure of the wound, he brought a lot of unnecessary metaphysical baggage to the operating table.
He really did.
Let's start trimming that baggage. His biggest, most famous concept is the will. This grand, underlying, blind striving that supposedly constitutes the base reality of the universe. From an internalist perspective, how much of that do we actually keep?
We keep the observable pattern, but we completely discard the magic.
Imagine.
Yeah. We do not need to posit a literal, mystical, cosmic substance called will vibrating behind the curtain of reality. That is a massive metaphysical leap that internalism, which restricts itself to phenomenological evidence, simply doesn't require.
It almost reads like esoteric sci-fi world building in Schopenhauer. You don't need a hidden, ghostly energy field to explain human behavior.
Exactly. Instead, internalism naturalizes and phenomenologizes the concept. We look at lived, conscious experience and observe that it is, in fact, heavily characterized by need, biological lack, striving, behavioral recurrence, and restless valuation.
So we can entirely retain the concept of a deprivation structure without reifying the will into a mystical entity.
We don't need magic to admit that biological life structurally feels like a constant state of depletion that demands to be filled.
Okay, the next piece of Schopenhauerian baggage. His views on boredom. Schopenhauer notoriously used boredom as his ultimate philosophical trump card.
He loved talking about boredom.
He argued that even if humans miraculously get everything they desire, they don't achieve lasting peace, they just succumb to crushing boredom. Therefore, he concluded, mere existence itself is inherently empty and fundamentally bad. Does internalism accept boredom as proof of cosmic failure?
Internalism accepts the psychological observation, but it completely rejects the normative conclusion.
So it's real, but it doesn't prove the universe is evil.
Right. It is demonstrably true that when the tension of desire is temporarily suspended, we often encounter a restless emptiness rather than profound tranquility. But internalism argues that boredom is simply the collapse of a specific value frame without the attainment of terminal peace.
It just proves that the absence of pain isn't automatically blissful.
Right.
It's a bit like living next to a highway. If the traffic noise suddenly stops, the silence is an immense relief for about 10 minutes. But eventually the silence itself ceases to be a relief and just becomes a vacuum you have to sit in. The relief degrades into emptiness.
That's a highly accurate phenomenological description, but here's the critical internalist tweak. Boredom is not as normatively basic or as authoritative as actual acute suffering.
How so?
Boredom is unpleasant, it generates a low-level restlessness, but it does not scream not to be in the violent, immediate, overriding way that a compound fracture or acute bereavement does.
The texts describe boredom as merely the ghost of willing that lingers after the desired object vanishes.
The ghost of willing, yes. It is an interesting psychological phenomenon, but you cannot use it as a blunt instrument to prove that all of existence is an irredeemable nightmare.
The third major area requiring surgery is Schopenhauer's notoriously bleak assessment of happiness. He largely treated happiness as entirely negative.
Negative meaning the absence of something else.
Right, meaning he defined happiness merely as a temporary cessation of pain. In his view, you only feel good because you briefly stopped feeling bad. It's just the momentary removal of a lacking any positive substance of its own.
And here, internalism firmly parts ways with him. Internalism argues that we do not need to be so dogmatic and reductionist. We can readily acknowledge that certain experiences of joy genuinely possess a positive, irreducible character.
Like what?
The profound awe you experience when listening to a masterful symphony, the deep, quiet tenderness of holding a sleeping infant, the intrinsic flow state of creating art, these do not easily reduce to merely a deprivation being removed.
They possess their own internal light.
They absolutely do.
But, and this is the absolute crux of the internalist position, while it admits joy exists, it completely rejects the idea that joy and suffering operate symmetrically.
This is the most vital distinction in the entire framework. Joy may illuminate consciousness, but suffering objects to its own existence.
That's an asymmetry.
Yes, joy is wonderful. It lights up the room of the mind. But the mere absence of joy does not generate the same primitive, screaming demand that the presence of suffering does.
Let me try an example. If I'm sitting in my living room on a Tuesday, and I am not experiencing profound, transcendent, ecstatic joy, I am generally fine. My state of being is not an emergency.
You're just sitting there.
Right. But if I'm in that exact same room, and I am experiencing profound, agonizing physical or emotional suffering, it is an absolute overriding emergency. The states are phenomenologically and normatively asymmetrical.
This asymmetry is the bedrock that allows internalism to maintain a properly pessimistic orientation.
Because it recognizes the unique, demanding, overriding authority of suffering.
Exactly. Without having to delusionally deny that positive experiences exist. It doesn't have to pretend that love and beauty are just illusions or tricks of the will. It just acknowledges that love and beauty do not possess the same structural urgency as agony.
Right. We have refined the theory. Internalism sounds incredibly robust when we are just analyzing it in isolation.
In a vacuum, yeah.
It acknowledges the reality of joy, it grounds the authority of suffering in undeniable internal experience, and it refuses to make wild, unprovable claims about the cosmos.
It's very solid.
But philosophy is never tested in a vacuum.
Mm.
How does internalism hold up when we force it to engage with history's greatest optimists, theologians, and meaning makers? It is time to run the gauntlet.
Bring it on. This is where the framework truly proves its resilience. Let's stress test it.
I'm going to throw 5 major philosophical and cultural frameworks at you, and I want to see exactly how internalism defends itself against each one.
Okay, I'm ready.
Starting with the ultimate anti-pessimist, Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche looks at this entire conversation about the objection of suffering and says, you are completely missing the point. What about human greatness? Suffering isn't an objection. It's the required friction for growth, power, and depth. We don't run from suffering. We affirm life through our suffering.
Nietzsche is a formidable opponent here because he rightly identifies that much of traditional pessimism is rooted in psychological exhaustion, what he calls resentment.
It's people who are too weak to handle the friction of life, so they try to declare life invalid.
Yes. Nietzsche wants to heroicize suffering. He argues that you can forge immense greatness, profound art, and deep character out of tragedy.
It's the archetype of the tortured artist, or the hero's journey where the trauma is the catalyst for the ultimate triumph. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Yes, but internalism asks a very sharp phenomenological question in response. Does the resulting greatness retroactively heal the torturous wound at the moment of its infliction?
Internalism says no.
Transformation is not retroactive justification. You can absolutely learn from suffering. You can integrate it. You can forge a vastly stronger identity because of it. But that utility does not mean the suffering itself was fundamentally good or neutral when it was tearing through your consciousness.
The source texts frame this perfectly. They point out that Nietzsche turns suffering into the raw material for greatness, but internalism asks whether greatness answers suffering from within or merely builds beautiful structure over it.
Growth after suffering is not synonymous with the justification of suffering.
Right. Just because a bone heals thicker and stronger after a horrific break doesn't mean we should throw a party to celebrate the act of breaking bones.
Precisely. The greatness is an architectural achievement built over the wound, but the wound itself, in the subjective moment of its occurrence, still contained that undeniable internal not-to-be objection. The asymmetry remains.
Let's move to the second framework in the gauntlet, Buddhism.
Ah, Buddhism.
Because, as I was mapping out the internalist idea of the deprivation structure, I couldn't help but draw parallels to the first noble truth. Buddhism begins with the premise that life is fundamentally characterized by dukkha, unsatisfactoriness, or suffering, and it explicitly diagnoses craving or desire as the engine of that suffering.
So you're asking, is internalism really just Buddhism stripped of its meditation practices?
Exactly. Is it just secular Buddhism?
It's an inevitable and natural comparison, and the overlap in their diagnosis of the human condition is significant. Both frameworks recognize that a consciousness structured by craving is a consciousness deeply vulnerable to suffering.
But there is a massive divergence in their ultimate projects.
Yes, Buddhism is fundamentally a soteriological path. It is a highly developed practical methodology aimed at liberation.
It offers a clear exit strategy.
Exactly. It offers a diagnosis, but its primary focus is the cure, a rigorous practice of insight, ethical conduct, and non-attachment designed to achieve the total cessation of suffering. Internalism, conversely, makes no claims to being a spiritual path or offering a cure.
Internalism is strictly engaged in foundational epistemic clarification. It is trying to map the territory, not build a road out of it.
The text highlights this distinction beautifully. It states that Buddhism asks how suffering can cease, whereas internalism asks why suffering has the normative authority to demand cessation in the first place.
Buddhism provides the practical map out of the burning building. Internalism provides the architectural and thermodynamic analysis of exactly why the fire is fundamentally incompatible with the structure of the building.
That's a great analogy. One is a practice of liberation. The other is a foundational theory of normativity. They are complementary, but they're doing different philosophical work.
Okay, let's introduce the third framework. Theism, specifically frameworks like Christianity that utilize soul-making theodicies. What happens when we introduce a divine architect into this internalist mapping?
This is a big one.
Theism frequently argues that suffering is not just random agony. It has a profound cosmic role. It's designed to build our souls, or it's part of a divine providence we can't fully comprehend, or it's the temporary result of a fallen creation that will ultimately be perfectly redeemed.
Internalism listens very carefully to those theological frameworks and categorizes them all as external narratives. Remember our spatial metaphor, meaning fails upward before it fails inward.
Right.
A robust theological story can absolutely provide a massive, comforting, cosmic context that helps a specific individual endure their suffering. It can give the suffering a role, a purpose, a character in a grand script.
But assigning a role is not the same as refuting the nature of the feeling.
That is the exact distinction. Even if a martyr goes to the flames fully believing their pain is serving a glorious divine purpose, the pain itself, the actual physiological valenced experience of the fire-destroying tissue, still inherently objects to itself.
The narrative container holds the suffering, and perhaps prevents the person from falling into despair.
But the narrative does not reach into the phenomenal core of the agony and neutralize its internal mechanism.
The source has a line that really distills this. A story can hold suffering. It cannot automatically absolve it. It doesn't arrogantly deny that religious meaning has immense psychological utility, but it denies that the meaning reaches backward in time and fundamentally alters the negative valence of the pain.
Exactly.
Okay, let's pivot to a completely secular framework. Existentialism. Think of Jean-Paul Sartre or Albert Camus.
Oh, the French existentialists.
They would agree with internalism that the sky is empty and there is no given cosmic meaning. But their response is, so what? Humans are radically free. We create our own meaning through our choices, our authenticity, and our deliberate commitments.
And internalism is perfectly happy to agree with the existentialists up to a certain boundary. It agrees that the universe doesn't hand us a prepackaged meaning, and it agrees that humans possess this incredible capacity to construct life projects.
You can absolutely decide that your self-created meaning is to master the cello, or raise a loving family, or dedicate your life to a political cause.
But the friction arises when those projects collide with the reality of suffering.
Exactly. Your created meaning does not possess the ontological power to neutralize the negative significance of a sudden, severe biological or psychological trauma.
If you have dedicated your entire existence to writing the great American novel and you were suddenly struck with agonizing terminal bone cancer, the existential project of the novel does not magically turn the bone pain into a neutral experience.
Right. Your projects can orient your life. They can provide a psychological scaffolding that gets you out of bed in the morning, but they do not ground, erase, or override the profound normative weight of suffering when it actually strikes the conscious subject.
As the texts explicitly state, meaning can be made. Suffering's objection is not made. You invent your life's purpose. You do not invent the reality that a severe burn is immediately aversive.
The objection is hardwired. The meaning is constructed. The final framework to test against internalism is probably the most ubiquitous one. It's what we might call ordinary humanist optimism.
Ah, the mixed bag theory.
This is just the everyday pragmatic view that says, look, life is obviously a mixed bag. Yes, there is profound darkness, disease, and loss. But there is also radiant love, breathtaking beauty, incredible creativity, and deep friendship. If you look at the whole picture, the light balances the dark. The good outweighs the bad.
Internalism's response to this everyday optimism is very gentle, but philosophically unyielding. Internalism does not ask you to deny the light.
It doesn't demand that you ignore the genuine awe of a sunset or the profound warmth of a lifelong friendship.
No, it is not committed to the edgy adolescent view that literally everything is misery.
So where does the mixed bag theory fail?
It fails because ordinary optimism relies on a mathematical ledger.
A ledger, like accounting.
Yes, it attempts to put suffering in the red column and joy in the black column, and it operates on the assumption that if you just accumulate enough joy, it mathematically cancels out the suffering.
Internalism completely rejects this ledger approach because of the asymmetry we discussed earlier.
It denies that a positive good experienced in one moment simply cancels out or justifies a profound suffering experienced in another moment, or by another person.
There's a devastatingly precise line in the text for this. It says, internalism does not deny the light. It denies that light elsewhere makes the wound not wound.
Let's use a stark example. If you are sitting with someone who is experiencing the profound, agonizing grief of losing a spouse, you cannot walk up to them, point to a beautiful Renaissance painting on the wall and say, look at this incredible beauty, therefore, mathematically, your grief is neutralized.
The light undeniably exists, but the wound is still a wound. The negative authority of the suffering cannot be balanced away by a surplus of joy.
That is incredibly sobering.
It is. So, internalism survives the gauntlet. It doesn't buckle under Nietzsche's heroicizing. It doesn't get absorbed into Buddhism's soteriology. It holds its ground against Theodicy's existential meaning-making and ledger-based optimism.
It's an incredibly sturdy framework.
But this leads us to the final, and frankly, the most ethically fraught part of this deep dive. Because philosophy isn't just a mental exercise.
No, it has consequences.
If internalism is true, if suffering holds this undeniable, unerasable negative authority that cannot be balanced away, how does this alter our behavior in the real world? Does it force us into extreme ethical corners? We need to look at the practical shadows of this worldview.
This is exactly where the rubber meets the road. If you truly internalize this asymmetrical view of valenced experience, it inevitably and radically alters how you view human action, risk, and responsibility.
And the most controversial, glaring shadow here is antinatalism. For those who might not have encountered the term in ethical philosophy, antinatalism is the position that it is fundamentally unethical to procreate.
It's a very difficult topic for many to engage with.
The argument is that because life inherently and unavoidably contains suffering, and because a non-existent being cannot consent to being brought into that suffering, it is morally wrong to initiate a new life. If I accept the internalist premise, am I logically forced to become an antinatalist?
The sources navigate this terrain with extreme caution. They concede that internalism absolutely, undeniably generates antinatalist pressure.
Pressure, yes.
If you acknowledge that life is structurally characterized by a deprivation structure and that valence suffering contains an absolute internal objection that cannot be balanced away by future joy, then creating a new conscious life is an incredibly fraught, dangerous ethical act.
You are guaranteeing that this new being will experience that unerasable objection.
But the text also pushes back against the sloppy extreme edges of the antinatalist movement. It provides a crucial warning. Do not moralize the void. Let's unpack that because it's a subtle but vital distinction.
Some of the more hardcore popular antinatalists fall into a linguistic trap where they argue that non-existence is good. They start treating the void, the state of not being born, as if it were a peaceful, happy, serene waiting room.
Internalism points out that this is a massive logical error. Non-existence isn't good because there is no conscious subject there to experience the goodness.
You cannot assign a positive valence to absolute nothingness.
Exactly. So the argument isn't that being unborn is a state of bliss.
The texts clarify that the point is not that non-existence is good. The point is strictly that suffering is internally objectionable.
Internalism doesn't necessarily demand a dogmatic universal cessation of human reproduction, but what it absolutely demands is that you strip away the romanticized, Hallmark card, culturally mandated view of procreation.
It forces you to recognize that having a child is a terrifyingly serious gamble because you are initiating a cascade of valenced experiences, many of which will contain absolute, internally screaming objections. It removes the casualness from the act of creation.
Okay, what about the other major practical shadow? Negative utilitarianism.
Right, let's talk about that. Traditional utilitarian ethics tells us we should maximize happiness and minimize pain for the greatest number of people. It treats joy and pain on a sliding scale.
But negative utilitarianism flips the priority.
It says the only moral imperative that truly matters, the only absolute duty we have, is minimizing suffering at all costs, precisely because of that asymmetry we discussed.
Since internalism privileges the objection of suffering over the illumination of joy, are internalism and negative utilitarianism just two names for the same thing?
They're intimately related, but they belong to different categories of thought. Negative utilitarianism is a decision rule. It is a practical algorithm for action.
It tells you, when faced with an ethical choice in the real world, always choose the option that results in the least amount of pain, regardless of the potential for joy.
It's the applied engineering of the philosophy.
Exactly. Internalism, however, is the bedrock epistemic foundation that sits beneath that engineering. It explains exactly why the negative utilitarian algorithm is justified in the first place.
The quote from the text maps this perfectly. Negative utilitarianism is what the insight looks like when turned into a rule.
Internalism provides the deep phenomenological observation of the ethical terrain. Negative utilitarianism is simply the map you draw to navigate that specific terrain.
As we begin to pull all these threads together, let's synthesize this incredibly dense journey. We started with the jarring reality of the Tuesday morning letdown.
And we used it to enter Schopenhauer's bleak, mechanical treadmill of desire.
We saw how consciousness is structured by lack, constantly mistaking temporary relief for actual fulfillment.
Then we analyzed traditional pessimism and saw how it often overreaches, becoming intellectually unstable by trying to put the entire universe on trial.
We stripped away that cosmic condemnation, we discarded the mystical baggage of Schopenhauer's will, and we drilled all the way down to the existentially immune core.
We found that the absolute bedrock of normativity is just the undeniable internal aversion within valent suffering. The feeling itself contains the entire objection.
And we stress-tested that core, watching it survive the collapse of all external meaning, successfully resisting the total erasure of nihilism while simultaneously rejecting the naive, ledger-based calculus of ordinary optimism.
So, after this deep dive into the absolute depths of pessimistic philosophy, what does this actually mean for you, the listener? How does understanding this highly technical distinction alter how you operate in the world tomorrow morning?
It alters your operating system because it offers a radically grounded, unshakable foundation for human compassion.
We live in a world saturated with clashing ideologies, where people constantly argue over whose suffering is justified by what historical narrative or what political goal or what divine plan.
Internalism cuts violently through all that noise. By accepting that suffering contains its own inherent absolute objection completely free from religious, moral, or cosmic decorations, we stop needing a grand, unified theory of the universe to justify helping someone who is hurting.
You don't need to agree with someone's politics, you don't need to share their religion, and you don't need to validate their worldview to recognize the absolute commanding authority of their pain.
Exactly. The meaning is entirely in the feeling. And when you finally recognize that the meaning is in the feeling, your ethical response to the suffering of others becomes much more immediate, much more undeniable, and vastly more universally compassionate.
The philosophical pessimism actually breeds a profound empathy.
That is an incredibly powerful, grounded place to land. But true to the spirit of this show, I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought to mull over on your own.
Oh, here we go.
It builds on the exact logic of everything we've just discussed, but it extends it outward into terrifying territory. We've spent this entire time analyzing human desire, human suffering, and human phenomenology.
Right.
But if the badness of suffering is an undeniable internal disclosure, completely independent of human moral frameworks or human intellect, what does that mean for the silent internal experiences of the non-human world?
Wow.
If a factory-farmed animal, or perhaps one day, a complex artificial mind experiences valenced suffering, internalism dictates that their pain inherently, absolutely objects to its own existence, even if they cannot speak a single human word or construct a single moral argument to tell us about it.
If the meaning is simply in the feeling, where does that leave our responsibilities to the rest of the sentient universe?
That is the ultimate, inescapable ethical frontier of this philosophy. If the wound objects, it matters not at all who or what bears the wound.
Something to think deeply about the next time you find yourself staring into your coffee on a Tuesday morning wondering, is that all there is?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the existentially immune core. Until next time.